Hello and welcome to Week 3 lecture for Cultural Perspectives Online. I'm Dr. Evvie Smith and this is about understanding of the self. So what is the self? How can we define this term? And how does it relate to our culture and the world around us? So let's start by having a look at some simple definitions, and I'll just move myself out of the way. So just to start, we're going to go through key points in the last 2 weeks. We've had some absence in some of our classes, so I will recap some of these for you, and this might be helpful for your assessment task. So we're going to be defining what is the self. We're also going to look at this idea of what is human agency and what does it mean to either have agency or to lack agency. And so what are the repercussions of this? And also we're going to look at different approaches to understanding the self, all right? So different theoretical perspectives. Now, you need to include these in your essays or, when you're talking about an idea, we need to look at it through an academic lens. So we're going to be looking at George Herbert Mead, Maslow, and some other theorists, Freud as well, that can help us to unpack the self and how it is understood by society and how it is also theorized. So it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs in particular that we're going to be focusing on, and also Freud's psychoanalysis. And George Herbert Mead also talks about this idea of a role that we take on. And so he is one of the early theorists on identity and the self, and many later theorists like Irving Goffman, Judith Butler, and all of those sorts of, sociologists draw from this idea that, we take on roles that are socially constructed. They are scripts that are provided to us, and we manipulate ourselves and our roles depending on various contexts and situational encounters. So we're also going to have a debate question that you can think about in your own time about this idea: are we really free or are we actually limited as people? So some key points from the last 2 weeks. We've looked at several elements that make up this idea of modernity. So in order to understand where we've come to today, we need to actually think about the past. And in modernity, we had some major changes happen in the world. And these changes really led to the kind of formation of, everyday life and kind of where we're at now. So these are kind of the big key areas that you need to make sure that you're familiar with. And we started from, say, the Enlightenment, okay, where it's a period where evidence and science and reason was spread across the world. So if you think about Enlightenment and, shedding light on people, not just turning to religion to make sense of, certain things or events that would happen. So the Enlightenment, was about new thought, new ideas, and people really risked their lives promoting some of those ideas as well. So this led to independent thinking, perhaps democracy in a way. The Western world, this idea about individualism emerged as well. So moving from a collective or a community society to more of a individual or, self-based society where we all try to get educated, we all try to get ahead, we all try to do the best we can at work. So Western society really is where the individual emerged from, and a lot of Oriental societies don't have that same view. We also looked at the industrialization, okay, with the kind of changing workforce, pollution, factories, changes in standards of work conditions or standardization of work practices, mass production, okay? So a lot of things were really happening in this period, which led to obviously urbanization, so those push and pull factors that led people to move from countrysides or agrarian rural-based cultures to city centres in search of work or change of lifestyle. And also with the Enlightenment and all of these new ideas came this term secularization, which is a turning away from religion, or kind of a focus on religion as being the only way to understand something. Democracy, so people have now the ability to elect, in some countries, not all, we need to remember that, to elect their representatives rather than having hierarchy, sort of having, royal families and things like that making all the decisions and just sort of being there by birth. It's more about people voting or, putting people in to represent them that they want, although the extent to which this really happens is debatable, particularly in our current climate. And then also capitalism. So capitalism is the search of, is the right to free enterprise, which is removed from state control. It is based on the idea of the search for mass profits. It is the right to have private ownership, as I said, but it is also about free markets, where markets make their own set their prices, they go up and down, and that people can hire and fire who they want. And, we have a sort of a growing gap between workers and, I guess, capitalists and, business owners, which perhaps is a problematic thing, but we can discuss that in our tutorials. So culture. So how do elements of modernity impact culture? It changes our whole way of life. It standardises our lives. Our lives have become somewhat standardised now, homogenous in a sense, although there are differences that we can debate across cultures. But these impacted the way we live, the way we speak, the way we work, the way we dress, okay, and the ways in which we relate to each other. So we also looked at these ideas of dominant cultures, minority cultures, subcultures, okay? So although there are norms, values and dominant groups in societies or privileged groups, there's always usually countercultures or cultures that resist certain ideas that are set by society. And through that resistance often leads to change. So we also talked about conformity, okay, and why people conform. And this idea of cultural relativism, which is related to your first assessment task. So with cultural relativism, it's about this idea of not judging another culture based on your own, okay? So you're not having this idea of an ethnocentric view where you see your culture as the best culture and everyone else is kind of, should be that way as well. Cultural relativism acknowledges that culture is relative, that it's contextual, it is fluid, that it's situational, okay? And so through cultural relativism, we can better understand other people, the ways we live and why we do things. So by the end of this topic, you should be able to understand, what human agency is, the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic fundamental needs that he argues humans want and desire, and they are different in different cultures. You should be able to describe, in very simple terms, Freud's understanding of the psyche. Also be able to understand the relationship between self and role expectations relating to George Herbert Mead's work on roles and, performances that we do, and formulate your own opinion about whether we're fundamentally free or limited by our culture. So let's start with what is the self. There are many ways that we can understand what this is, and we often throw this word around and never really think about its true definition. But what you need to take away from this unit is there is no one definition to describe things, okay? There are many ways in which we can make sense of something, and the self is one of those things, okay? So definitions, if we, if you want to look up online, maybe some ways in which the self is described, you will see that there are many different ways, okay? But do those dictionary definitions really tell us much, okay? I would argue that they don't. So we need to look at academic sources, and we need to think about the ways in which these sources might differ from one another. So according to Collins from Jari and Jari, it says that the self is a mental construction, okay, of the person, by the person, but inevitably formed from social experience. Okay, so what that means is that we are socialized beings. We don't go through life with, hands over our face, not talking to anyone. Maybe some people do. I don't. But we are influenced by the world around us, the people we meet, and how people see us, perceive us. Okay, so it is also a construction. So it's a way in which we think of ourselves, okay, and we construct that because we kind of, step outside of ourselves and think about, okay, that's how we're perceived, that's who we are. So it's a mental construction of who we are by us, and it's often formed through our social experience or influenced by that. Now, if we unpack this definition a bit more, so a mental construction or an idea, okay, which means it's made up. So it is constructed. It is not naturally occurring. And ideas can change, okay? So therefore, so can our sense of self. And that's very important to remember, that our ideas relating to self do not always stay the same. They may change, they may shift, they may go back and forth, okay? So the self is not a static kind of entity that we create. It is often always in a state of flux and change. This idea of by the person, so it concerns a person's relationship with themselves and an understanding of who they are. And experience, this is the idea of ourself from an individual person's, that an individual person develops through our experience in society, as I said, such as through relationships and cultures. So human agency, what does this word mean? So from last week's topic, we discussed this idea about cultures, norms, shared values, beliefs, and systems of symbols that exist. And one impact of this is that culture encourages conformity, okay? So culture encourages people to conform to particular ideas in order to maintain a status quo, to keep structure, and to obviously keep certain people privileged above others, okay? So people tend to think and act according to that in order not to experience the diminished kind of life opportunity or, work opportunities, relationship opportunities, whatever it might be. So human agency, or the word agency, describes a person's ability to act freely. Okay, that is without being constrained or held back by the demands of a society. Now, some people have, it's not just like we wake up and go, hey, I've got human agency, woohoo, it doesn't work like that. So some people are in positions where they can actually have this, or demonstrate or enact this more so than others because of their positions that they might be in. They might have more security, they might kind of have more visibility, whatever it might be. So race, gender, class, ethnicity all come into play here. So if you have the power to make choices, you therefore have agency. So if you look at these images here that I've put on the screen, which image represents human agency? And I want you to look at them, think about them, and come to the tutorial and let me know which one you've picked and why. So if we think about selfies, for example, selfies are a very modern kind of way of performing our identities, okay? And Erving Goffman is a sociologist whose work, which is called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It was written in 1959. And this text is very helpful to apply to selfies, to, kind of unpack. Although the word selfies didn't exist in 1959, Goffman talked about this idea of social interactionism and how we often try to guide the impressions that other people may form of us. So selfies is a great way or a modern way through technology to really manipulate our identities. So if you think about the ways in which people pose, the ways in which people, might use different lighting or other technological things to filter the photo, crop it, whatever, they are ways for us to present an idealized image of ourselves to the world and therefore guide the impressions that other people may form of us, which Goffman calls impression management. So if we think about also, oh, sorry, I'll just move myself over. So we take a selfie to represent who we are as a person, okay? But who we are is based on what society and culture has taught us to be. It's not that I'm this fabulous individual that's just, you know, born this way. That is not the case. Yes, you might be a fabulous individual, but what we do is we choose from scripts, okay? So in society, there are scripts that are laid out to us, and nothing is original, okay? So all of our ideas, we pull from those scripts, but they are limited. So there are certain roles, costumes, ways of talking that are attributed to each of those scripts. So we put that on like a mask. So Goffman kind of suggests that we are all actors on a stage. And his theory is based on this idea of a dramaturgical metaphor, okay, of dramaturgy. So agency and freedom. Now, we live in a culture that values freedom, and people often talk about and believe in the importance of freedom, okay, as being a fundamental human right. Part of our understandings of self is based on the idea that we are all individually free. But do you freely choose or have agency over things like what you eat, what you wear, your career, or how you spend your money? Think about that. And the answer is not so clear cut. So we often have things online even that try to tell us or mold us into thinking about we're a certain person. Things like personality tests, for example, on Facebook, and other indicators, like star signs. These things seem to suggest that there is something innate or intrinsic or natural about who we are. However, as we've already started to discuss, there are some external factors as well that influence who we are. And we can think of this as part of the nature versus nurture debate. Now, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Maslow was a theorist who was born in 1908, early 1900s. His work was produced. And he proposed a classification of basic needs into 5 categories. And those categories are self-actualization, okay? This is about kind of people being at one with themselves. So peace, having knowledge, self-fulfillment, personal growth and advancement, realization of personal potential. Esteem, so this idea of achievements, having status, having confidence, prestige in a community, recognition, mastery over certain things, or independence. Another one, which you might agree on, or you may not agree with these, is the idea of love. So he argues that we all have a fundamental need to belong. So love can come in many forms, though. So think about friendship, family, community. It all relates to this idea of intimacy and love and belonging. And those who don't belong often experience limited opportunities and life chances. Safety, okay, so this idea that we all want to be safe. So personal and financial security, health, order, law, protection, and all those sorts of things. And physiological, so breathing, having food, water, shelter, sex, clothing. These are sort of fundamental needs to survive as humans. So how does it work? According to Lester, Maslow suggested that these needs appear sequentially as a person develops from birth to adulthood. The lower needs are more powerful than the higher needs. And the more these basic needs are satisfied, the better the psychological health of the individual. There's also Freud, who really delves into this idea of psychoanalysis. And Sigmund Freud's work was very controversial, and you might know a little bit about it, but his work developed from the idea that some bodily illnesses appeared only to be explained by mental rather than a physical cause. And he examined what he called the psyche, and that is the unconscious ground of mental life. So his ideas are very complex, and I don't expect you to all know them right now. There is the reading on views that you can have a look at that I've put up there for you. But in simple terms, Freud tried to explain the importance of unconscious processes in forming and shaping the self. Okay, so the unconscious is beneath. It's not to the forefront of our mind. It's kind of deep within. And he did this by studying certain things. Okay, I'm just going to move this out of the way again. There we go. So patients we would now describe as having mental illnesses he studied, and things such as memories, dreams, and slips in speech. Okay, you know when you call up your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you accidentally call them by your ex-girlfriend or boyfriend's name? That would be a Freudian slip. Okay, and Freud would suggest that somewhere deep down, you're perhaps thinking about that person still. You know, or when you've got something else on your mind and it slips out and you say the wrong word. That's what we call a Freudian slip. So memories and dreams are very hard things to analyse, very controversial because they are, people argue, unreliable. But this idea of the unconscious, we can attribute or kind of liken to this idea of an iceberg. So the unconscious, most of that is underneath the surface, and what we perform to the world and what the world sees about us and the self is only a small portion of who we are. So Freud understood the mind as structured into three particular parts. The first one is the id, so the store of unconscious desires, and operates on the pleasure principle. Okay. Then there's the superego, which is the internalized voice of parental and cultural attitudes, and it operates on a moral principle. And finally, the ego, or the rational self, that operates on the reality. So the struggle between these three areas really shapes our personality. It's the tension between all of these that we negotiate and navigate that produces or influences who we are. So the psyche only becomes visible through dreams, memories, and Freudian slips. Okay, so I've put two videos here that you can look at. Some really funny Freudian slips from news reporters and stuff like that that you might want to watch. You might get a laugh out of. But Freud's theory of personality, you can see this meme here. Id, I want it now. Ego, I need to do a bit of planning to get it. And superego, you can't have it. It's not right. And you can link those to each of the ones on the side that I put there for you. So our last theorist that we're going to discuss is George Herbert Mead and his theory of role-taking. So George Herbert Mead theorized that play is crucial to the development of self because that is where we learn to take the role of the other. So through play, through dressing up, through costumes, that is when we kind of develop a self in a way, because we learn how to take on these roles. We learn how to dress like this, or we learn how to be like this, okay? So think about what this might mean. We can discuss this more in class, but if you think about a play that children might do, they dress up as fairies and princesses and things like that, or, as doctors and nurses and stuff like that. That shapes ideas about gender, about, kind of work expectations and work roles, and therefore sets that in place from a very young age. So Mead's three stages. The first stage is about imitation. So he argues that under age 3, people have no sense of self. Okay? You might agree or disagree with that. But stage 2 play is the ages between 3 to 6. And this is where children often pretend to be others. And stage 3, and often, just to repeat on that section, we often tell children or boys, oh no, don't wear that, don't dress up in that. And that is where those roles are established, because people then believe that they can only be certain roles and only certain people can dress in certain ways. Stage 3 is this idea of team games. So learn to take on multiple roles at the same time. Now, as we grow up, this process teaches us to think about the expectations of others. As we age, we internalize the expectations of more and more people. And for me, taking the role of others leads us to become cooperative members of a culture. And this ability helps us to anticipate how others will react, and we modify our behaviour or self accordingly. So, with all this in mind, are we free to be ourselves or are we limited? You tell me. So, there are tensions between culture and freedom, always, okay? So, we live in a society that tells us we are free, but are you free? Are your free choices actually limited by that culture? So, what do you want to eat? What do you want to really wear, buy, or do for a living? And the self is very complicated. So we believe that we are free, but at the same time, we may conform to many cultural norms without knowing it. So we may also resist these norms. And that is, despite pressure to conform, we do still have agency. So there is often a tension in our understanding of self. Thank you for listening to our lecture for week 3, and I look forward to seeing you next week in our Zoom tutorial. Take care.